On today's episode, we are going to take a look at why ARK Investment is super bullish with data centers. And even though they don't say it, I believe they're super bullish in one of my favorite companies right now, and that is NVIDIA. And if I may be honest, they seem a bit bearish in some other big semiconductor companies. And these are two players that you guys might own. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the thumbs up, and follow me on Twitch where I live stream and I take a look at stocks you want me to look at. So let's get started. If this is your first time here, this is episode 4 of Big Ideas of 2021. Before you leave, don't worry, you do not have to watch these episodes in order. What I'm pretty much doing is just taking a look at all of ARK's investments, big ideas of 2021, and kind of explaining it and taking a look at stocks that belong in that market. And today we're gonna take a look at data centers. So data centers are pretty much the power plant of computation, and ARK believes that they're gonna go through a huge revolution in the next few years. Cheaper, faster, and more power efficient processors are starting to displace Intel. For cloud computing, ARK believes that ARM, RISC, and graphics processing units are likely to emerge as the new powerhouse processors. And if I may be honest, this bullet point is a bit confusing in my opinion. It kind of makes it seem like these three segments that I talked about, ARM, RISC, and GPUs, are in one segment, but they're pretty much two different forms of technologies. The two segments would be ARM and RISC are in one, and GPUs are in the other one. But GPUs, we already know who is a huge leader in that market: NVIDIA. In data centers, they believe accelerators, which are mainly dominated by GPUs, will become the dominant processor. Who's the current processor right now? The CPUs. So ARK believes that GPUs is actually going to take that lead, growing at 21% on average for the next 10 years. So the big revolution that ARK believes is coming in the data center realm is this architecture revolution. Right now in 2020, the architecture being used is the x86, and that owns about 92% of the market share. And I'm going to explain what these architectures are. Right now, the x86 architecture is being used by some of the big CPU players, right? So we have AMD CPU family, they use the x86 architecture. We have Intel with their Xeon data center CPUs are also using the x86 architecture. That's why right now x86 architecture makes up 92% of the current market. ARK believes that by 2030, ARM and RISC architecture is going to make up 71%, and the x86 is going to drop down to 27%. So now let's take a look at what architecture means. So I created this quick infographic. It's a very low level, so I'm pretty sure we have some really heavy tech guys here. I just want to make it simple so everybody, even people outside of the tech company, can kind of understand. So we start off with some form of hardware, right? Right here I have a picture of a GPU. So this hardware doesn't do anything by itself. It works with the software created to decide what this hardware does. That software is created by software engineers, and this is pretty much writing what this hardware should do. Unfortunately, when we write this software, we write it in human language, and the machine doesn't understand that. So we take it into a compiler. This compiler turns that human language into machine language. This machine language is pretty much this architecture. So one can say the Ryzen CPUs talk x86 language. ARK Investment believes that the future language that technology is going to talk is going to be the ARM or the RISC-V language, right? So now we understand. So why do languages matter? In quick explanation, some languages are faster than others for certain phrases. For example, in human language, saying a specific phrase in English might use less words than saying it in Spanish. So ARK believes that right now in the clouding phrases, right, in a lot of these clouding phrases, the ARM language is going to be the best language to use in form of resources. And you guys might have heard of ARM. ARM is being used in a lot of chips right now. They're mainly used in the mobile and the Internet of Things. I do believe a lot of the Qualcomm chips are being used are using ARM architecture. This RISC-V is a whole different type of architecture. And like I mentioned, ARK believes that by 2030, ARM and RISC-V would go from a 0% market share to a 71% market share. So ARK believes that ARM could power the majority of developers' PC by 2030. Right now in 2020, almost all software developers write code on Intel's x86 platform architecture. And why is that? Because most CPUs right now in developers' computers, from your AMD to your Intel CPUs, are using Intel's x86. ARK believes that by 2025, 60% of the developer codes or developers' PC are gonna be using ARM CPUs, and only 41% will be using the x86. A perfect example right now is Apple plans to transition their Macs, and Macs are being used by 1 out of every 3 developers from x86 to ARM over the next 2 years. At the same time, Microsoft is doubling down to support its efforts to support Windows on ARM processors. So these are some 2 big players moving to this ARM world. And you might be like, Jose, okay, we're learning a lot about ARM. How can I invest in ARM? Unfortunately, ARM is a private company right now. NVIDIA is trying to acquire ARM, and if the deal does go through, NVIDIA will probably be the best play to do it. Unfortunately, like we mentioned, ARM is kind of the language that all these other semiconductor chips use. So there's been a lot of kind of like tension and fighting, allowing that NVIDIA doesn't buy out ARM. So there's always that risk. The only other way to go about it is to find chip companies that are using this ARM processing. Some of them are Qualcomm. They use it a lot for their mobile processors. AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon are also some players here. And if you guys know other players in using ARM architecture, make sure to share with the community. Post on the comments below. It's great to know what are some other companies using them. And now if you're a big bull in either Intel's or AMD data center CPUs, I'm gonna ask you to cover your ears. So ARM could become the new standard in the cloud. And right now, Amazon, their AWS, which is their Amazon Web Service, is the largest public cloud provider in the world. I believe they own over 30% the market share of the clouding market. And Amazon recently launched the Graviton 2 ARM CPU. So they just launched a CPU made by Amazon using the ARM architecture. And this is going to reduce the need of purchasing chips from Intel and AMD. We're saying, hey, the biggest clouding provider right now is now making their own chips, so they're not going to need AMD and Intel in the future. Maybe right now, as they are still producing, they might still buy off chips from them, but ARK believes that AWS is likely to migrate most of its servers to ARM-based processors. And here they have performance of this ARM Graviton compared to Intel Xeon, which is their data center CPU. Unfortunately, we can't see AMD's EPYC CPU family here on performance. Maybe some of you guys can share some of those. But we can see the ARM Graviton is better performing and at a cheaper price. So if you're like me, a huge NVIDIA bull, this is definitely the page you guys are waiting for. By 2030, the accelerator should replace the CPU as the main server computing unit. When we talk about accelerators, we talk about GPUs, which are, like I mentioned, we have NVIDIA there, we have AMD there, and Intel is kind of entering that market. Now we can see why this accelerator market is continuing to grow. We have the TPUs. This is tensor processing units. This is something being developed by Google. And then you have your FPGAs, your field programmable gate arrays. Some great players in the FPGAs, for those that are not familiar, are Intel. Xilinx, however it's pronounced, which is being bought out by AMD, is another player. Now we can see why AMD is buying the FPGA market. This is the one where they see huge growth coming. Lattice, which is ticker LSCC, is also in the FPGA market. And we have Microchip Technology, MCHP, also in this market. And all these accelerators are used for demanding computing tasks. For example, artificial intelligence analytics, drug discovery, cloud gaming. ARK believes that the GPUs will be the dominant accelerator market during the next 5 years. Looking at this, I'm seeing a few other trends. I'm seeing small growth in the actual memory department, but remember, memory is pretty much needed for almost all these departments. So if the accelerators are seeing a huge growth, these accelerators need memory in them. So another market that I do believe is very, very bullish is the memory market. We have Micron Technology, we have Hynix, I forget, is another player there. And if you are bullish in the CPU market, again, I'm gonna ask you to cover your ears or maybe even close your eyes. You can see that the CPU market is actually expected to decrease in the data center from a $30 billion market to about a $27 billion market in 2020 to 2030, where the accelerator is going from a $6 billion to a $41 billion. So pretty much to break down is, first, the CPU revenue is expected to decrease from 2020 to 2030 in the data center revenue, which is a big player right now for these CPU companies. The second thing we learned is ARM and RISC-V architecture is going to overtake this x86. So we have to find companies that are using this ARM and RISC-V architecture. The third thing we're seeing is accelerators are going to be the future for this data center technology. And the huge leader in that data center technology is GPUs. And one thing I want to say is, right, this is episode 4, and out of all these 4 episodes, there's one technology that has been kind of reoccurring, and it's a common theme, and that is the GPU market. And it's not that I'm seeing it because I am I'm not bullish in NVIDIA because I'm not bullish in NVIDIA, right? I'm bullish in the GPU market. So it's not like I have my eyes closed on NVIDIA only. But NVIDIA is one that I have to say is the leader in this market. And I want to say, as an electrical engineer, the amount of technology I see being used by this GPUs is insane. And it's definitely where the future is heading. In the last 4 episodes, deep learning, data center, virtual worlds, digital wallets, all talked about GPUs. And like I mentioned, to me, the biggest player right now in that market is NVIDIA. They are being very, very aggressive with the research and development. I think they've learned a lot from Intel, that they can't get complacent with where they're at. And the CEO there is just going 110%. He just has his foot all the way down on the pedal, and is making sure no one is coming close to them. So to me, I want to say ARK is a big player in NVIDIA. They might be very vocal about being very bullish in Tesla, but I do want to say the one they should be the most bullish on would be NVIDIA, based on their big ideas of 2021. Who knows? The stock price might go down, but I do want to say, if the stock price of NVIDIA does take a huge, massive dip, I am going to be a nice buyer. I personally would enjoy closing most of my positions and putting it all on NVIDIA. So take care, guys. Have a good night, and I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode.